A new Axios poll shows 20% of Americans are up for a national divorce. Marjorie Taylor Greene's dream may come true. The number of women dying during childbirth rose 40% in 2021. That's according to new data from the CDC. San Francisco's First Republic Bank will not go under. A deal was announced today in which First Republic will receive a $30 billion injection of cash from nearly 12 banks, including J.P. Morgan Chase, Bank of America, and Bank of America, Citigroup, and Wells Fargo, who are each depositing $5 billion in the bank. Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley will each deposit $2.5 billion. Former Fed Chair and current Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen testified today that America's banking system is sound and that significant steps have been taken to stabilize the markets. The stock market had its best day today since January. As the 20th anniversary of George W. Bush's illegal invasion of Iraq approaches, the Senate today moved forward a bipartisan bill repealing 2 military authorizations for the use of force against Iraq. The bills are expected to be signed next week by President Biden. As Syria's civil war enters its 12th year, the United Nations reports today that half of Syria's population is now hungry. French President Emmanuel Macron raised France's official retirement age to 64 from 62. The president took advantage of a clause in the French Constitution, Article 49.3, to act unilaterally without the consent of the parliament. A no confidence vote is now expected. For more on this, we are joined by Congressman Alan Grayson. He served as the U.S. representative for Florida's 8th Congressional District from 2009 to 2011 and Florida's 9th Congressional District from 2013 to 2017. His latest book is High Crimes: The Impeachment of Donald Trump. Welcome back, Congressman Alan Grayson.
Thank you. That's pretty grim news, but that's normal these days.
Well, it can't be any more grim than my inviting you to be on this show.
Obviously, a sign of desperation.
So you're coming to us from Orlando, Florida. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And your governor, yes or no, is Ron DeSantis. Is that true?
Guilty as charged.
Okay.
I didn't vote for him.
Okay, so if we have time, these are the stories I'd like to cover with you. The bank bailouts. You're an economist besides being an attorney. I want to talk to you about Biden's new take on guns, the GOP versus Medicare, long COVID, and where woke goes to die, if we have time for that. So Governor Ron DeSantis, your governor, earlier this week said Ukraine is not a vital interest for America. He referred to the war between Russia and Ukraine as, quote, a territorial dispute. Senate Republican Whip John Thune was asked if Republicans in the Senate agreed with DeSantis. I'm going to play you a clip right now.
And that it's more merely a territorial dispute.
Well, I mean, I think that there are lots of different opinions on U.S. involvement in Ukraine, but I think the majority opinion among Senate Republicans is that the United States has a vital national security interest there in stopping Russian aggression, and that's certainly the view I have.
So, Congressman Grayson, Republicans seem to be torn on Ukraine. We seem to be hearing a lot of Republican members of the House, like Kevin McCarthy, the Speaker, saying no blank check for Ukraine. And even others, the Freedom Caucus, are almost hinting they support Putin. Are there Republicans, obviously in the Senate, we don't see them. Are there Republicans who support Putin? And if so, why?
Well, it's sort of inadvertent. There is a very strong caucus among Republicans of whatever Biden's for, they're against it. And those are the ones who you're talking about. There's always been a kind of a division among the Republicans about just attack the other side, no matter what the issue is, versus those who still bear an ounce of reality in their worldview. So what you're seeing is they're attacking the United States' support for Ukraine just because Biden is in favor of it and for no other reason.
For no other reason, or are they possibly getting money from Vladimir Putin? I know that Howie Klein, our mutual friend, has suggested that.
I don't know. I don't have any information on that. But really, in my experience, they don't need any more motivation. They were born bought by dictators and anyone else who is not on our democratic side of the ledger.
Okay. DeSantis, you live in Florida. How bad is he? Is he more of a danger to this country than, say, Donald Trump? Who would you prefer to see in 2024 running against Joe Biden?
So I have to choose between Tweedledum and Tweedledummer. Is that what you're telling me?
Well, is DeSantis that dumb?
Yeah, he really is. I
Didn't he
served with him
graduate
for a
from
number of years.
Isn't he a graduate of your law school?
Yeah, he went to Harvard and to Yale, which just goes to show you that every once in a while they make mistakes. He's dumb. He's a colorless hack, and he's going to find that you can't run a personality campaign unless you have a personality. It's going to go really bad for him.
Is Florida a disaster? Does he have a record to run on, specifically COVID? Can he run on his anti-vax, anti-mask, anti-Fauci platform? Did it
He
succeed?
seems to think so. I mean, he belongs to a party that seems to care only about fetuses and not any living people. His record on COVID was probably the worst in the country.
But do the numbers
we
bear
went
that out? Do the numbers show that? Because I don't see those numbers
Yes,
coming out
and-
of the CDC.
Well, I'll tell you where to look. We went through a series of spikes in COVID deaths. In the first one or two spikes, Florida was toward the back of the pack. For instance, when it was ripping through the Northeast, when it first came to the United States, and ripping through California. And then later on, when people understood what kind of countermeasures needed to be taken, we were the worst in the country in many respects. In other words, from the close to the bottom in terms of death rate per capita to close to the top or at the top. Many times we were actually number one. And when DeSantis says Florida's number one, that's sort of what he's talking about.
Okay, you're an
He's
economist.
talking about.
You're an economist, so you can make numbers sing. But as what I understand, the overall scores, Florida is not doing that badly. That makes me wonder: was he fudging numbers? Weren't there accusations that he was trying to control?
Yes, Florida stopped reporting its COVID deaths after a while. And they reported them with a 1 week lag, so they wouldn't show up when people were checking the daily numbers. There were other allegations of fudging as well, like instructing the doctors that if there was any comorbidity, they should count the comorbidity as the cause of death.
Right.
But the bottom line is that he was anti-vax, he was anti-mask. He pardoned everybody who had been convicted of violating the curfew. He did everything that he could to maximize the death count in the state of Florida from COVID. That's why he's called DeSantis.
And who do you think will be tougher for Joe Biden to beat, DeSantis or Trump? Can DeSantis move towards the center and peel off any Biden supporters? I know you do polling on these things.
I mean, he can try to do anything he wants, but this is someone who thinks that recycling is a government takeover of the trash. He thinks that traffic lights are a government takeover of the streets. The guy's a nut.
And he's taking on Disney, which begs the question, how free market is he really?
Well, that's not even a question any longer. I mean, Trump changed that entirely.
Right. What do
He's just following Trump's lead in that regard. The party is the pro-dictatorship party, and if it happens to be corporations who are standing up to them, then they treat it the same as ordinary human beings.
Where do you stand on Ukraine? Is there any, my feeling is whatever DeSantis is for, I'm against, and whatever he's against, I'm for. I know that the military-industrial complex is controlling the White House foreign policy. West exec lobbyists are now in the State Department. And so is Putin as big a existential threat to Europe and the rest of the world as Biden has painted him?
I think so. Trying to be objective about it, you go to the people whose lives are on the line, and you ask them. When confronted with aggression, military aggression, the history of the human race is checkered. For instance, just to give you one example, without making any sort of moral criticism, when the Nazis invaded the Netherlands very quickly gave up. They just said, we see no point to this. We're just going to give up. Compare that to what's happened in Ukraine. The Ukrainians have a willingness to fight that makes all the difference in the world. If they're willing to lay their lives on the line, then that indicates that it's probably a worthy cause. And the same thing is true watching how Finland and the Nordic countries in general have reacted to this. How Moldova, which just changed its government to a more pro-Western government, has reacted to this. The people in the area, not just Ukraine, but the people in the area, feel enormously threatened by the Russian government and by specifically the Russian military. It's basically the domino theory again, but this time it looks real.
What do you say to people who maintain that Obama, Hillary, Victoria Nuland were behind this invasion? It goes back to the Maidan Square, the Maidan uprising, that our CIA orchestrated the overthrow of Yanukovych and ended up installing Zelensky, and this is why Putin invaded and seized Crimea and ultimately invaded Ukraine, that he was provoked by first Obama and Hillary and then Biden's White House.
It's delusional. I was on the Foreign Affairs Committee at the time. If we had that kind of power over other countries, I certainly would have known about it. We don't. We just don't have that kind of influence in other countries. And if you're looking specifically at Ukraine, all you have to do is look at the election results in that country to understand why the revolution occurred. The country was completely polarized, much like the United States is polarized today, geographically. And Kiev happened to be inside of the Ukrainian-speaking language area. I mean, this is a country that can't even agree on an alphabet, for God's sake. Mm-hmm. And to think that they're going to accept the fact that a Russian speaker coming from the eastern side of the country was going to be able to take over the whole country with a very, very tiny majority vote, with the rest of the country dead set against him. And that's why the revolution occurred.
Right.
Apart from, the fact that many Ukrainians, speaking both languages, felt there was no future with the Russians and their future was with the West. But the real reason is that the country was extremely polarized at the time. And now what's happened is that the Ukrainians have basically won that, the Ukrainian speakers have basically won that argument. They've won that argument because Russia's exposed itself as being violent and aggressive and offering people no future.
Right. And Zelensky is a Russian speaker as well. It's not
right.
It's
right.
Not like
and he's Jewish, which makes it that much harder for the Russians to depict him as a Nazi, as they've tried to do.
Right.
The Russians have consistently characterized the Ukrainian speakers as pro-Nazi, because some of them during World War II were pro-Nazi. But that was a long time ago, and it's not reflective of what their grandchildren may think or feel.
And they were pro-Nazi. They were pro-Nazi because a lot of them felt that Stalin had colonized them, and they thought wrongly that Hitler was going to liberate them.
I mean, it's well documented that Stalin caused 2 or 3 million people to starve in Ukraine.
Right.
So yes, that made them sympathetic to any other power source.
A lot of people think that Biden and Blinken, his Secretary of State, tricked Putin into invading Russia to create a quagmire. You know, Zbigniew Brzezinski, Jimmy Carter's national security advisor, took credit for the Soviet Union being tricked into invading Afghanistan so they could have their own Vietnam. Do you think...
It's just delusional. That's not how they make their decisions. If you want to know how they make their decisions, just go to the Kremlin website and read. Just read what they say there. Putin himself has posted frequently at the Kremlin website, and what he says very specifically is that there is a greater Russia. It's an historical entity, and he regards Ukraine as being part of it, period.
Right.
That's the motivation. That's all the motivation that you need when one person is making all the decisions.
As a Democrat, I know you support Bernie. In the general, you, like me, went with Biden. Do you feel Biden is doing enough to bring Putin to the table?
Oh, I don't know if it's enough to bring Putin to the table. I tend to doubt it, but the question is he doing as much as is prudent under the circumstances? And the answer is it's a very difficult choice. The military has a fair amount of information that we don't have about that. The CIA has a fair amount of information that we don't have about that that's not public. Seems to me like the judgment calls are mostly going in the favor of Zelensky's government. And that's really all that you can do. You can't kind of like micromanage from outside the decisions that are made inside of the administration. It seems like the decisions are reasonable.
Okay. Let's turn to the 20th anniversary of George W. Bush's illegal invasion of Iraq. You were my hero during that war. You were the most, I think, well, one of the most vocal opponents of this illegal invasion. Today, the Senate moved forward on a bill that would get rid of the war authorizations against Iraq. What does that mean? What were the war authorizations? Were those essentially our declaration of war without an actual declaration of war?
No, it's called an authorization for the use of military force, an AUMF, and what it is it tries to finesse the Constitution, which says that Congress shall make declarations of war. And frankly, the administrations over the years have had a lot of trouble since World War II mustering the support that's necessary for that. So instead they do these AUMFs and then stretch them, like basically they stretched the bin Laden AUMF to cover basically everywhere in Asia, most of Africa, and parts of Europe. And that's what that's referring to. I think that it's at this point only symbolic. I ran against the war before it was fashionable. The Wall Street Journal, of all places, said that before I ran for Congress, I was conducting a one-man war against war profiteers in Iraq.
Yeah,
that's true.
As a lawyer.
As a lawyer, that's right. I was prosecuting war profiteers in Iraq, and that was when nobody else was willing to take these cases because the Bush administration was so much against them. They wanted no bad news coming out of Iraq, so they would overlook the worst kinds of corruption there. I mean, I'll give you an example. I did the only actual jury trial involving war profiteering in Iraq. When the time came for the government witnesses to show up, they had to go all the way from the Pentagon to the Alexandria Courthouse, which is 2 stops on the Blue Line, the subway system in Washington, D.C. And they said it was too far away, so they weren't going to send their witnesses. You know, that's the kind of stuff we had to put up with. But all it did was expose to me how corrupt the system had become, and that was my primary motivation at the time for running for Congress.
When you look at, you famously said it's hard for you to think about Dick Cheney without imagining all the blood pouring out of his mouth as he speaks. When you think of somebody,
Not exactly. Wow, that's not. I mean, that I was being wry. You were being dark.
I like a dark rye. I like a dark rye.
Right, pumpernickel. You were being very pumpernickel there.
I think but you were pretty much saying that Dick Cheney has a lot of blood on his hands.
What I said, which was funny in context, but you're not making it sound that way, is I was being interviewed on MSNBC. And the interviewer said to me that he had interviewed Dick Cheney, I believe this is how I recall it, a few weeks earlier. And I said to him, when the interview was over, did Dick Cheney turn into a bat and fly away? That was the origin of that line. Okay. Now, the line has been repeated many times. It's like a game of telephone at this point, all right?
Okay.
But I think you'll agree, as a professional comedian yourself, that's a funny line.
Yes, of course it is. Of course it is.
Okay.
So let's talk about the mind of somebody like Dick Cheney and the war profiteers. His Halliburton famously did well from the invasion and from Katrina. We had Lawrence Wilkerson on a radio show that you've been on, Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson. He has been very apologetic. He was Colin Powell's chief of staff during the war, and he has apologized. Whereas nobody else, Doug Feith, Wolfowitz, Scooter Libby, Pearl, they don't apologize for this war. They think it was mishandled. If Bremer, who was like the viceroy, the second viceroy of Iraq, had he not told the elite Republican Guard, go home, there were something like 400,000 soldiers that Saddam Hussein had, and he sent them home without permission from Rumsfeld or Cheney or Bush. They were shocked that he had done that, and then they were out-of-work soldiers who became guerrillas and started killing our troops. Had Bremer not sent the elite Republican Guard home, could this thing have worked? Or was it doomed from the start?
There were an awful lot of mistakes, and what you just described historically is one of them. And the reason why we were able to dampen things down to the point where it was possible for us to leave is that we put the, quote, sons of Iraq on the payroll. All these people who maybe at an earlier point were members of Saddam Hussein's party, and a bunch of other tribespeople who belonged to his tribe, were literally put on the payroll by the government. This is not classified information. They were put on the payroll by the government, our government, and paid so that they wouldn't kill our troops.
That was basically the surge, wasn't it? Wasn't that basically Petraeus's surge in 2006? Cash?
Yeah, the surge was a cover, for what I just described. Yeah. So to the extent that earlier we had made that strategic decision to cut out all of Saddam Hussein's people, and therefore many of them took up arms against U.S. troops, which they might have done anyway, by the way. We counteracted that by buying them off several years later. But there were many. The biggest mistake of all is that we did not provide the people of Iraq with a functioning government of any kind, whether it was Sunni, whether it was Shia, whether it was Kurdish. I mean, the Kurds did okay because we never really occupied Kurdistan. So there was nothing, they couldn't possibly blame us for what was going on there. But in terms of the area of the country from Baghdad down to Basra, it just wasn't a functioning government providing anything like visible, normal public services for many years. The classic story of this is that we prevented water purification on one of the dirtiest rivers in the entire world. We prevented it by occupying the country, shutting down that system or destroying it, and then not replacing it for a very, very long time. And the military was oblivious to this. There were 7 million people living downstream from Baghdad who would be basically, enjoying everybody else's dung from up the river.
Right.
And we just didn't do anything about it for years. And that was the most difficult problem of all. Whatever anybody's ever going to think about an occupying force, when they turn on the faucet and brown stuff comes out, they know that things have got to change.
Yeah, like in Jackson, Mississippi, and Flint, Michigan.
Exactly, and that's what they were living. That's how they were living for years after the occupation started.
You were on the show last year. We were talking about, I think, an airline bailout, and you said the government should just buy American Airlines. And it made sense. Instead of bailing it out, it would cost less to buy one of the airlines.
I pointed out that it would cost less to buy it than to bail it out. Yes, okay. I said that. I wasn't saying they should do that. I said that it was the numbers added up that way.
Let me ask you a serious question. You're an economist.
Right. We all have our cross to bear.
The invasion of Iraq, conservatively speaking, $1 trillion.
No, not if you count the veterans' injuries, the health care for life.
$3 trillion?
That we have to give. No, I think the last number ended up coming in at 4 last time.
Oh, then it's a lot of money. Now, okay, I was gonna say it wasn't a lot of money. No, okay, I hate to be glib. $4 trillion. This is a serious question. We look at capital money being weaponized against the United States. It's got to go somewhere, and it's a cancer. People in America are paying rent to absentee landlords, and it's Blackstone, it's hedge funds their money has to go somewhere, so they destroy entire cities by buying houses and apartment buildings. It's weaponized capital. Why in the future can't we democratize a country? Instead of spending all this money on weapons, why can't we send Blackstone and these hedge funds into Syria and just have them buy the country? Is that a better way to spread our horrific values to the Middle East and around the world? The capital has to go somewhere. So why don't we unleash these, David Rubenstein from the Carlyle Group, these horrible men? Why don't we send them to Syria and have them buy it? Wouldn't that have a slightly better resolution than bombing these people?
Well, here's a daunting comparison for you, okay? We were year after year after year in Afghanistan. We were spending $100 billion a year. And military expenditures were $100 billion a year in Afghanistan. The entire total of goods and services produced by the Afghans is less than $50 billion a year. We literally could have put every single one of them on our payroll, every single one, man, woman, and child, on our payroll, and it would have been cheaper than what we were spending to send 100,000 Americans over there to be shot at. And in some sense, that's crazy.
Okay, let's turn. You have 5 more minutes? I wish we did this every week. I wish we did this every week. Let's talk about the banks. Janet Yellen, who used to be the Fed chair, she is now Secretary of the Treasury. She testified today before the Senate Banking Committee, and she said this. Well, let's see if I can play it. I may not be able to. Here we go. Here we go. Sorry, my mistake. Here is Janet Yellen, Treasury Secretary, today.
This week, the government took decisive and forceful actions to stabilize and strengthen public confidence in our financial system. First, we worked with the Federal Reserve and FDIC to protect all depositors of the 2 failed banks. On Monday morning, customers were able to access all of the money in their deposit accounts so they could make payroll and pay the bills. Shareholders and debt holders are not being protected by the government. Importantly, no taxpayer money is being used or put at risk with this action. Deposit protection is provided by the Deposit Insurance Fund, which is funded by fees on banks. Second, the Federal Reserve is providing additional support to the banking system with a new lending facility. This will help financial institutions meet the needs of all of their depositors. I can reassure the members of the committee that our banking system is sound and that Americans can feel confident that their deposits will be there when they need them. This week's actions demonstrate our resolute commitment to ensure that our financial system remains strong and that depositors' savings remain safe.
So Silicon Valley Bank collapsed last week. The Republicans are blaming its woke policies. Your governor, Ron DeSantis, is blaming the banking crisis on woke policies. Democrats, like Senator Elizabeth Warren and Congresswoman Katie Porter, are blaming a bipartisan bill that was passed, I think, in 2018. It raised Dodd-Frank's threshold for what constitutes a bank that is too big to fail from $50 billion to $250 billion in deposits. Banks that are too big to fail are subject to these stress tests. And because Silicon Valley Bank was no longer categorized as too big to fail, it wasn't subject to these stress tests, according to Senator Elizabeth Warren and her student in the House, Katie Porter. Is that true, that had this bipartisan bill not been passed in 2018, Silicon Valley Bank, I think with assets of $50 billion, would have been subject to a stress test, and the regulators would have spotted this?
Well, everything he said up until the end was accurate, and everything that Yellen said is factually accurate, but not quite on point. So let me start with what you said there at the end. My understanding is that the bank had assets of around $200 billion. So
okay.
It fell underneath the new threshold, and that there were, quote, stress tests, but they were spaced out more than that. And frankly, these stress tests are automated at this point. Responsible banks do them, whether or not they're asked to do them. And I think that the problem that was experienced would not have been detected by a stress test because it was a run on the bank. That's really not what stress tests are about. Stress tests are about seeing if there's a dramatic change in market conditions, like for instance the price of bonds or the interest rate on bonds, what would that do to your portfolio? And that's the kind of stress they're talking about. They're not talking about the stress of $45 billion of withdrawals in one day from one bank. That's the kind of stress that nobody could survive other than the Fed and possibly the U.S. Treasury on a good day, and maybe the ECB.
But they were making bad bets. This was a bank that was betting on the bond market and not hedging any of those bets, apparently.
Well, on the other hand, bonds and currencies are the most liquid investments in existence. So if you were worried that there'd be a run on your bank, you would want to have bonds in your portfolio. And the bonds that they were choosing were relatively short-term bonds. They weren't buying as far as I know, they weren't buying 30-year bonds because that would have actually shown up on a stress test
but they
very
did come
badly.
Up, they sold the bonds, as I understand, they sold the bonds and came up like $1.5 billion short because of the Powell raising the interest rates. So they were making bad investments in bonds, right?
They had a $200 billion balance sheet and they lost $1.5 billion in bonds. That's not the reason why this happened. The reason why this happened is because Peter Thiel and other people caused a run on the bank. And that's a problem, honestly, that we probably would have seen earlier, given the fact that we have anybody can go on Twitter and try to start a run on the bank. Anybody can go on Facebook and try to start a run on a bank. The shocking thing about the situation is not that it happened. And of course it happened to Silicon Valley Bank because that's where people are most attuned to the internet. That's, I think, why it happened there.
Wow.
The shocking thing about it is that it hasn't happened earlier.
So you're saying this was a
This was the second
manufactured
and third.
Peter Thiel manufactured a bank run?
That's my understanding.
Wow.
And this is something that we have had to live with since banks developed the fractional reserve system about 500 years ago.
Right.
That's how long it's been. The only real innovation since then has been deposit insurance in the 30s. But this has always been a vulnerability of the bank system. How could it not be? I mean, what do they do when they get your money from you? They turn around and they lend it to somebody else, or they buy bonds with it, or whatever you want to call it. But any kind of counter transaction to your deposit is going to involve a certain amount of risk unless it's cash. If they just keep your cash in the bank, which nobody's going to do, that's really not banking. If they just keep your cash in the bank, it's there if you need it. But anything other than that, any form of actual banking involves risk that there's going to be a run on the bank.
Is Thiel behind San Francisco's First Republic Bank being in trouble, or Barney Frank's signature? We have to get to Barney Frank, who I love. Barney Frank's Signature Bank. Is Thiel behind that, or is that just a continuation of the run that started with Silicon Valley Bank?
It's a continuation of the phenomenon, not a continuation of that run. The fact is that now, because news grabs us, everybody is now sort of familiar with the concept of a bank run, which really hadn't been part of our consciousness until essentially now. I mean, the earlier bank failures that occurred were not bank runs per se. There were banks that were just run into the ground so badly that they ended up with no equity. Now, you talked about a $1.5 billion loss on their bond portfolio. If you're talking about earlier bank failures, the whole portfolio was endangered or even sometimes wiped out. That's what happened with the savings and loans way back in the 80s and so on. That's how they got in trouble. This is going back to an earlier time, like in the 1890s in the United States, when, for one reason or another, a whole bunch of people would get into their heads at the same time that their deposits were not safe, and they'd be correct in that regard. In the same way that we ascribe meaning to a rectangular green piece of paper with a picture of a dead president on it, we ascribe meaning to bank deposits, and they lose that meaning when everybody needs to get their money out at the same time.
Right. Had Glass-Steagall not been repealed, would Silicon Valley Bank be buying bonds? Was this going on before Clinton?
I think that, well, in regard to your point, it is true that banks have had more permission to, quote, invest rather than to lend. The traditional responsibility of banks has been to lend out their money to companies and people who borrow it from them on certain terms. So, for instance, mortgages. Okay, the mortgages are the classic loan that banks give out to people, and Glass-Steagall prevented anything else from happening. That's all that, essentially, I mean, I'm oversimplifying, but I'm simplifying anyway. But the Glass-Steagall prevented banks from making, quote, investments rather than lending out in general. And the repeal of Glass-Steagall made that different. But bear in mind that I don't think that's what caused this problem, because the only liquid assets, well, for the most part, the only liquid assets that Silicon Valley Bank had were those bond investments. That's it. Everything else was out there and on, some kind of extended arrangement, even credit card debt. Your bank has no right to call you up one day and say, okay, we need the whole 15,000 right now. Okay, they can't. They're not allowed to do that. So even if Silicon Valley had been lending out its money to customers on their credit cards, there was no way for them to get that back quickly. I think it's wrong to blame the bond investments in terms of what caused the run and what caused the crisis. What caused the crisis is $45 billion of deposits being demanded back on the same day.
Okay. I want to play you a clip of you in 2009. When First Republic is bailed out, they received a $30 billion injection of cash today from JP Morgan Chase, Bank of America, Citigroup, and Wells Fargo. They're all depositing their own cash into San Francisco's First Republic, probably Republican Bank, to stabilize it. That doesn't mean JP Morgan Chase is giving the bank $5 billion. It's just depositing the $5 billion. This is a grand total of $30 billion. They're saying, here are our deposits. We're not going to take it out until you're stabilized. Is that how it works?
Well, it's not how it's supposed to work. They're improvising. No, I mean, the way it's supposed to work is the bank goes into receivership. And if it gets any money, it's supposed to be from legitimate sources like the FDIC's funds. What's happening here is that
with TARP, this was Bush and Paulson and Bernanke, and they called in the 5 big bankers and said, you're all taking an injection of federal cash. Whether you want it or not, you're taking our money. This is different. It feels like the Federal Reserve and Biden and Janet Yellen have been talking, jawboning with Jamie Dimon and Bank of America and saying, no, this time you bail out the banks. Is it a little different this time?
Well, it's only different in form. I mean, one thing that Dodd-Frank did was to try to crack down against this sort of thing and at least hold the managers and the shareholders accountable for their mistakes.
Right.
You know, let's compare this to Silicon Valley or to Barney
Let me play you a
Frank's
clip. Let me play you a clip from 2000. This is you from 2009. You're sitting on Barney Frank's banking committee, and AIG got bailed out and then paid its executives exorbitant bonuses, and you were not happy about that. Do you remember not being happy about that?
I remember being unhappy in very many points of my life.
Okay. This is from right after the financial crisis of 2008. This is 2009. The great Congressman Alan Grayson.
The last question is questions from the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Grayson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In capitalism, winners have to win and losers have to lose. People are normally rewarded for success and they're punished for failure. Now, we went through an experience where between the middle of 2007 and the end of 2008, that 18-month period, we lost $12 trillion in our country's net worth. According to the Federal Reserve figures, the net worth of America dropped from $62 trillion to $50 trillion by 20% in the last 18 months of the Bush administration. Is there any sign that since these bailouts began, that the institutions and the individuals on Wall Street and in major banks who were responsible for the decisions that led to that loss of $12 trillion actually were held accountable for it? Any sign at all? Professor Stiglitz?
No.
Ms. Minow?
No.
Professor Babchak?
I think some of them lost their positions, some of them lost money, but by and large they have not been held sufficiently accountable. And the most important thing is we don't yet have incentives going forward that would make people do the right thing in terms of risk-taking.
Well, you raise an interesting point. I actually asked the head of AIG who actually were the people responsible for their losses that led to the government bailout, and he wouldn't even tell me their names. Isn't it possible that the people who actually led to this financial disaster, not only in America, but around the world, are still doing the same jobs and very often down the block from where they were before?
I think in fairness, some of the key people did lose their positions. Some of the top people at AIG are no longer there. But I think that I agree with your sentiment that probably they have not been held sufficiently accountable. And most importantly, many of them have been able to pocket and still keep large amounts of money that were based on results that they had in 2006 and 2007, which were disastrously reversed in 2008.
What does it mean for a capitalist country like the United States if over a long period of time failure is rewarded and capital destruction is rewarded? What does that mean in the long run, Ms. Minow?
Bankruptcy.
For the country.
For the country.
Professor Stiglitz.
It obviously is has a very adverse effect on the efficiency of our economy, and that's why I've called it sort of air Sox capitalism. It's not real capitalism, where you socialize the losses and you privatize the gains, and that leads to distorted behavior. And that's why a lot of what we're talking about is going forward. It's not just dealing with the past; it's going forward. That unless we correct these incentive problems at the organizational and individual level, we're likely to have exactly the same kind of problem again.
May I give you a compliment, Congressman?
Yeah, thank you.
May I give you a compliment first?
Yes, thank you.
I want to give you. I want to give you a compliment. Except for your dashiki and the handlebar mustache, that ages very well. Except for except for your fashion choices, that ages incredibly. I don't know why you thought a handlebar mustache and a dashiki was appropriate. But
well, you've got the clip. But what I often did in hearings like that, particularly the ones involving Fed witnesses from the Federal Reserve, is I wore a tie that had nothing on it but monopoly money.
Oh, right. I remember. Yes. So that was 2009. Are the same people? Jamie Dimon is still there. Are they still there?
It's the same mentality, and there's such an enormous difference between what happened with SVB and what's happening when you've got like a gang of corrupt bankers circling and taking their own depositors' money and their shareholders' money and force feeding it to a failed bank. That's Capone style capitalism.
What's going on now?
What's doing? Yes. Well, right now, I mean, what happened with Silicon Valley Bank, at least as far as we know, is that the depositors got bailed out, which makes sense because you can't know what is behind the curtain when you deposit your money at a bank.
Right.
Yeah. Everybody has this vague understanding that more than $250,000 could be problematic, but it's beyond the anywhere near the ability of the ordinary person trying to decide where to put his paycheck to know whether the bank that he's depositing in is a sound bank or not. So of course you have to make good on that because that depositor didn't make a mistake. But that is not true of the shareholders. That is not true of the officers. That's not true of the directors. There's no reason why you would keep them on the gravy train after that point when you have to take other people's money and public money to make good on the mistakes that they made. So there's a huge difference between saying to the depositors, we will make sure that you are not out of pocket because of the effects, the ripple effects that would have, versus what we just saw, which is here's $50 billion, we'll make the problem go away.
So let me just, so I understand this, it's a little complicated. The TARP, the 2009 bailout, was the federal government temporarily owning the banks. SVP, what's going on, Biden's rescue, is anybody who deposited cash, $250,000 and even above, it's safe. But the investors in that bank, you're not getting anything. And what's going on with San Francisco's First Republic Bank, this deal that was announced today, that's gangsters protecting other banksters protecting other banksters, because it's not the federal bailout. It's just banks bailing out other banks and protecting.
And it's even worse than that, because they're not doing it on their own. They're doing it because the Fed is telling them to do it with a nod and a wink and saying to them, we'll make sure that you're okay over this, which they did with Citibank 10 years ago. You know, they made deals with Citibank that were just completely ridiculous so that they could prop up Citibank and make sure that Citibank showed a profit no matter what.
So nobody is going to be punished.
Bailout.
Nobody gets punished for this.
If you were Jamie Dimon, would you peel off $10 billion of banks' returned earnings, knowing that shareholders could sue you, knowing that depositors could turn you into the next victim and go run, get their money, and go out the door? Would you do that unless you knew that the Fed was backing you up? The Fed is backing them up. They're just basically basically a front man for bailouts that the Fed knows it has no legal authority to do.
But Biden is keeping his promise that taxpayers are not going to bail out the banks.
One way or another, that's what it is, because first of all, if they're doing it on the basis of a nod and wink Fed promise, it's going to end up that way. Secondly, the Fed isn't technically taxpayer money, but look at the inflation that we've had for the past few years. That was because the Fed doubled its balance sheet and the money that it lent out in the course of 2 years during COVID. They bought every Treasury bond in sight. They were the only buyer for long periods of time of Treasury bonds, and they took that and they basically turned those Treasury bonds into little rectangular pieces of paper, which caused inflation.
Right.
So
let me play you
another. The taxpayer is going to be stuck with it.
Okay, last clip, I promise. One more clip, please.
Go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah.
Mitt Romney. This is a clip from yesterday's Senate Budget Committee hearing. It's Senator Mitt Romney losing his temper with White House Budget Director Shalanda Young over Biden's act. This is going to get you really upset. I saved this for last. This is Senator Mitt Romney losing his temper. It's with White House Budget Director Shalanda Young. Romney is upset because during the State of the Union, Joe Biden accused Republicans of wanting to cut Medicare and Social Security. And so this is a clip of an angry Mitt Romney asking for proof that there have ever been any Republicans who have talked openly about cutting Medicare and Social Security. And then he bleeds into how Democrats are ignoring the solvency of Social Security, which I know you'll want to speak to. So this is an angry Mitt Romney. It's a 3-minute clip, but it's worth it because it's Mitt Romney having a temper tantrum.
I'm not aware of anyone in this category, but are you aware of anyone of the elected officials we have in the federal government, at the Congress or anywhere else, that have proposed cutting currently proposed cutting benefits for Social Security of any kind?
Senator, I have heard of proposals.
No. You've heard of proposals from a current senator, currently or congressman, currently proposing to cut benefits to Social Security?
Yes. Have they changed their position?
No.
Maybe.
No.
Yes. Members who are current members.
I said, has anyone in the last several months or the last year, has anyone, Republican or Democrat, proposed Social Security benefits?
So now you're asking if people change their position? Maybe. But there are records.
Are you aware of anyone?
There is a record.
Are you aware of anyone? Excuse me. Are you aware of anyone? Are you aware of anyone proposing cutting Social Security benefits?
Your first question, current members have well-known policies out there to cut Social Security and Medicare.
That's simply wrong. That is simply wrong, and it's not honest to say that to members of Congress. That is simply wrong. There is no one who's recommending cutting Social Security benefits, all right? Number one. Number two, do you recognize that in the next 10 years or so, the trust fund on Social Security is going to run out, and under the law, benefits would be cut dramatically, like 25%. You're aware of that?
I'm aware.
Yeah. That's a problem, right?
Of course.
Well, why is it then that in the president's budget there's no effort to address that whatsoever?
And while we clearly disagree on this, there are some who have policies on websites. I'm happy to print them and send them to the committee. Whether they have changed their position is another thing. Who want to have policies.
I'm sorry, that was not the question. The question was.
So this president.
I'm sorry, you got to answer the questions
so
as opposed to change the topic. I asked the question: Why does the president's budget not lay out how you would protect Social Security?
This president believes the existential threat to Social Security are those who want to cut it. His budget says no.
There's nobody in this committee that wants to cut it. I know of no Republican or Democrat in the House or the Senate who is proposing cutting Social Security benefits, and it's dishonest to keep saying it. It's offensive and dishonest and not realistic. We have a problem in Social Security. We need to address it. You agree we have a problem in Social Security. Make it clear, 1,000%. No Republican is proposing cutting Social Security benefits. Now, the question is, why have you not proposed in your budget any action to protect Social Security?
Senator, I look forward to seeing plans that are very clear.
The question is, why have you not proposed it?
Why have you not made a proposal? They will not cut Social Security. This president has put it in black and white. We look forward to seeing a plan that suggests that Social Security is off the table. This president believes the biggest threat to Social Security are those who want to cut it. His budget says no.
You know, I really do find that just offensive in the extreme, which is you can't name anyone who is proposing Social Security benefits. I have said, and I know my colleagues, no one is proposing cutting Social Security benefits for our Social Security recipients. No one is proposing that on our side. And you keep on saying that's the biggest threat. The biggest threat is in 10 years or so, the Social Security Trust Fund runs out of money and benefits get automatically cut by 25%. We don't want that to happen. I'm upset that the president hasn't included any effort to address that shortfall because I want to protect Social Security benefits for all of our recipients. Now, the question I have is, you do, fortunately, look at Medicare and suggest, hey, we need to take action to protect Medicare. I agree with that. I'm glad you do. You propose, however, the only solution is not cutting costs at all, but only raising taxes. Do you believe there's any prospect that Republicans are going to vote to raise taxes only as a way to save Medicare?
For those over 400,000, I hope so, that they would raise those taxes.
I said, do you believe that Republicans in the House and in the Senate are going to vote to raise taxes and nothing else, just raise taxes to save Medicare?
Well, that is not the only proposal. If you look, the net investment income tax, which was always created to go into the Medicare Trust Fund and was not, we suggest moving that over as a part of keeping Medicare extended by at least 25 years. So that's one part of the proposal. That is not a raising of tax.
Do you believe, I know my time is up, do you believe that it makes sense for a bipartisan effort to work together to find compromise positions, common ground, to actually save Social Security and protect Medicare?
Yes.
Thank you.
Somebody had his magic underpants in a bunch. Congressman Alan Grayson, bipartisan. What is the difference between bipartisanship and appeasement?
Well, I'm not going to answer your question because I have something else on my mind at this point, and you're going to have to maybe indulge me.
Okay.
I introduced the only actuarially sound bill to make Social Security solvent forever. It's called the Social Security Forever Act, and I had 0 Republican co-sponsors. The basic concept is what's known as scrap the cap, which means that you pay into Social Security up to a certain dollar amount each year, and then it stops. So you scrap the cap, and you keep paying into Social Security throughout your entire income all year long if you're making more than, let's say, $160,000 a year, whatever the cap happens to be this year. Not only that, but I did that without an increase in benefits, because if you increase the benefits at the same time as you scrap the cap, you end up with an actuarial problem. So I actually introduced as far as I know, the only bill in all history that would have solved this problem, and I had not a single Republican co-sponsor. Right. I could go on, but you want me to stop there for a moment and catch your breath?
Yeah.
If you want me to, all right. So in addition to that, it's my senator from my state who proposed not just cutting Social Security 10 years from now,
yes,
but eliminating it 5 years from now.
The sunset.
And that's Senator Rick Scott.
Yeah, the Medicare thing.
Right. If it's not reauthorized, if it's not passed all over again, then both Social Security and Medicare would disappear in 5 years. And Mitt Romney knows very well that that's true, and he knows who was responsible for that. But here's the thing. It wasn't just one guy out of 100 mouthing off. He actually proposed it when he was chair of the National Republican Senatorial Committee. So it was basically the official policy of the Republican Party to eliminate Social Security and Medicare in 5 years.
But in
I think
his
the president was too light on them.
Right, but in the Republicans' defense, McConnell turned on your senator for proposing that. In defense of McConnell.
Not until after the election.
Oh, I think he marginalized your Scott during the midterms. He was pissed off about that. He went.
Well, he marginalized Scott because Scott
spent all the money.
Spent all the money.
Yeah.
Right. McConnell had to go in and pass the hat among his Wall Street billionaire friends in order to make up for all of the money that Scott had squandered.
Right. I'm not going to defend Mitch McConnell, but he felt that Scott had gone off the reservation without permission and proposed on his own this sunsetting of every bill after 5 years. And
along with a lot of other things in that piece of that he put out there in the name of the Republican Party, that just happens to be on page 23.
Right.
You've never seen such an enormous collection of bad thinking in politics, because generally speaking, if people want to screw everybody, they don't come out and say it.
Right.
That's what he did. He just came right out and said it while he was in charge of the Republican Senate campaign.
Not to give the Republicans a pass, they've always been against Social Security and Medicare. Ronald Reagan made his career warning us that Medicare was the last stop before communism. So they've always been against it.
So did Herbert Hoover after he left office for years and years.
Right. I could keep going with you, sir. Congressman Alan Grayson is my hero. I remember watching you before I knew you on the floor of the Senate, and you were fearlessly saying what had to be said. And I hope you eventually decide to get back into politics. Alan Grayson served in Washington. What were the years you were there? You were U.S. Representative for the 8th Congressional District, 2009. Right.
2011, and then they moved the lines after the census, so it was something of the same different district, something somewhat different, and then from 2013 to 2017.
And then you quit.
And I've been in office since 2017, and look what happened to this country in the meantime.
I know.
I mean, whose fault is that, really?
You
can't blame me for all the stuff that's happened since 2017. I've been out of office.
Well, you left office to run for Senate. You'd still,
right.
So now is DeSantis?
Yes, and the person I ran against actually had said on the record in public in an interview that he wanted to cut Social Security, which you think wouldn't go over very well with the public in Florida. But he beat me because he was backed by President Obama and by $8 million of party money.
Party money. Does DeSantis have to change the law? He has to quit being governor in order to run for president, right?
No, he doesn't.
I thought that was the law.
No, I have looked into that recently. I don't believe that's a correct reading of that law. I wish it were, but it's not. I mean, anything that would get DeSantis out of office would certainly be a blessing. Okay. But that's not the way that works. If you're running for president or for Senate or for Congress, I don't think the law applies.
Okay. Thank you, Congressman Alan Grayson.
My pleasure. Thank you, David.
Thank you.